Hello again, everybody. Looks like we had a lot of interest in the Back for the Attack review video. Several views on that one, so thank you for that. Now it's time for us to take a look back at the Breaking the Chains album, finally. What this video is going to wind up being, more or less, is sort of a recounting of how Dokken actually formed into the band we all got to know and love, the Don Dokken, Jeff Pilson, George Lynch, Mick Brown Dokken, and all the complicated details of that first album, which was actually like three slightly different albums. Now, if you've kept up with the Hard Rock book reports here on Hard Rock Reverie, then hopefully you saw episode 1 of that series, which covered chapter 5 of the book, Nothing But a Good Time. In that chapter, we get a ton of information I'd never heard before about how Don got together with George and Mick in the early LA days, and how they wound up forming the band Dokken. This stuff is endlessly fascinating to me, so I hope it is for you too, because I just seem to keep wanting to talk about it for whatever reason. I'm a glutton for punishment, apparently. Anyway, my plan is to start with a general recap of that information and then go into all the different versions of this album before finally rating the songs we got on the major Elektra release we're all mostly familiar with. So here we go. All right. So George and Mick are in a band together called The Boys that's playing the LA club scene at the same time a certain band called Van Halen is playing those clubs, trying to get signed. George Lynch, as yet completely unheard of by most of the world at that time, is said by Dokken to have been a shredder like Eddie. And according to most other people who were on the scene at that time, Lynch is definitely mentioned as a player in the same breath as Van Halen and Rhodes. Some guy named Dokken also happens to be playing those same clubs back then. This is 76, 77, 78, with his band Airborne. Don recalls Airborne and the Boys actually playing some shows together back then and remembers thinking the Boys were a really good band, one that he thought would be the next band to get signed after Van Halen. One Kim Fowley, manager of the Runaways, among other things, is wanting to manage the Boys and is getting them gigs opening for the Runaways, who by this point already have their first album out. So that puts us somewhere in 76 when this is all happening. This DJ named Rodney even brings Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley down to the Starwood one night, sometime in 77, to see the Boys play. Gene and Paul are in the Boys' dressing room before the show, telling the Boys they're looking for a band to take back to New York with them to record some demos and to open some shows for Kiss. Basically, I get the impression they were interested in discovering some new bands. And the Boys have got to be thinking at this point, oh my God, holy shit, is this really happening? But then the show starts, and some band called Van Halen happens to be the opener that night. The Boys are apparently good enough that Van Halen is opening for them on this certain night. And Gene hears Van Halen first and is like, fuck that. This is the band we're going to take back to New York with us. Now, don't forget, Quiet Riot is playing around LA at this time, too. The Quiet Riot with Randy Rhoads, Kelly Garney, Kevin DuBrow. The version that released those two Japanese albums before Randy Rhoads auditioned for Ozzy. And at this point, New Wave is taking over the LA clubs. And all these long-haired metal bands are cutting their hair and putting on their skinny ties and playing more poppy material. And according to George Lynch in chapter 2 of this book, the Boys morphs into Exciter and gets a girl singer. In the meantime, Ozzy has been fired from Black Sabbath, and Ozzy comes around looking for the next hot young guitarist, for what's going to be his new Blizzard of Oz band. Okay, so we all know the story by now. Dana Strum gets contacted somehow by Ozzy, and Ozzy tells him he's looking for the guitarist for his band. Dana asks him, "Have you heard Randy Rhoads?" Ozzy says no, so Dana sets it up. Now, George Lynch has also either already auditioned for Ozzy or is about to when Randy walks into that door, barely plays anything for Ozzy at all, and pretty much immediately gets the job. Okay, perfect, right? I mean, for the whole world, perfect. We all get introduced to Randy with Blizzard of Oz, a legend is born, and we don't know anything about some guy named George and won't for at least a few more years. Meanwhile, pages 37 through 41, Mick Brown. Don Dokken had his eye on Exciter. And after the Van Halen thing closed the door on other bands, meaning once Kiss took Van Halen for their New York demo sessions, and nobody else got any interest at all because Van Halen just kind of sucked the air out of the room. They were so good. Everyone was making a move to try something new. So he approached us and said, he being Don, said, "Listen, I'm going to go to Germany. I know Dierks, who produced the Scorpions. I'm going to record some songs. Can I take your song, Paris, and record it?" And we said, no. And he did it anyway. George Lynch. That's not exactly true. I did say yes under the condition that we work our business out and he come over to the house and we kind of talk about it and we do an agreement and I show him the song and all that kind of stuff. And that he keep me posted as far as what the business opportunities were for the song and what exactly he was going to do with it. Well, none of that other stuff happened. He just felt he got an okay, and then he took two songs that were Exciter songs that I wrote. Don Dokken. I asked him if I could use the song Paris, the riff and the chorus. I didn't like the lyrics or the melody. I wanted to change that. And finally, George said, he just doesn't remember. He goes, "Yeah, we don't play that song anymore. It's over with," because they had moved on to kind of a new wave vibe. They had a girl singer now in their band. They cut off all their hair and they were going full on toward the whole new wave thing. Otherwise, I wouldn't have done it. But I just kept the riff and I kept the chorus and then I rewrote all the lyrics and melody, and that's how it came to be. George Lynch. I saw years later in a contract he had signed to a publishing company in Germany, World of Music, that he sold these songs for 25 or 35,000 Dutch marks, which is quite a bit of money. And, that's pretty underhanded to say the least. Don Dokken. I went to Germany and Dieter Dierks was going to be in Hamburg for a night and he came to see me play and he said something to the effect that Klaus Meine from the Scorpions had heard his voice and things were going to slow and he thought my vibrato sounded very similar to Klaus's. So that's how I ended up singing background vocals on the Scorpions' Blackout album. Then I did more demos after I sang for the Scorpions, and Gabby Hoffman, the manager of Accept, who were also recording in Dirk's studio, took my demo to Hamburg and got me a record deal on a French label, Carrere Records. But I had no band at this time, so I went back to LA with a deal but no band. Mick and George weren't doing anything, so that's when I asked them to join. They said no. I said, "Well, I'll give you guys like $1,500 and you can get a free trip to Germany. We'll throw some songs together and make an album." Wild Mick Brown. Don called and he goes, "Hey, I recorded some of your songs and I have a small record deal. Would you like to be in the band?" I was living with George at the time and I looked over at him and I held my hand over the phone. I said, "Listen, this son of a bitch took our songs and he recorded them and he's got a record deal." and he wants me to be in the band. And George was just steaming. He was like, wow, you just raped me of the last thing in my life I have. But before he could think about it, I went back to Don and I said, I'll do it if George can be in the band as well. And he went, well, I don't know. He knew there was going to be problems because he'd already lied to him. But I convinced George. I said, listen, we've got nothing else going on. Let's take a chance. All I could think was, man, we're hitting the wall here. It's getting late in the game. I'm already 22. I said, let's go to Germany. At least our music will get recorded with us playing on it. And goddamn it did. Don Dokken. Of course, after I got the record deal, George said, you stole my song. Alan Niven, executive Green World Distribution, Enigma Records, manager, Guns N' Roses, Great White. I think there was some sort of creative friction there too. George definitely had an extremely high opinion of himself. He claims to have developed the hammer-on and tapping technique before Eddie Van Halen. And I tend to sit there and go, both of you fuckers are liars. I think Harvey Mandel did it before both of you. But that's musicians, and Don is very much a songsmith. I would say that it was just chalk and cheese in terms of personality. Michael Wagener, producer, mixer, Motley Crue, Dokken, Great White, Stryper, Poison, Skid Row, Extreme, White Lion. We recorded Dokken's first album, Breaking the Chains, in Germany, which was basically my first production. There was tension in the band between Don and George. Their egos kind of did their little thing. To me, that tension was not necessarily bad, but then again, I only saw it in the studio, and I kind of tended to control that between the two. Don Dokken. When we did the album in Germany, George never even finished the record. He left before it was done. And I had to finish it by myself. Mick and him hopped on a plane and went home. They basically decided that if you can get a record deal, we can definitely get Exciter back together and get a record deal. So I gave them their money, their $1,500, and they took off. Wild Mick Brown. We didn't want it to be called Dokken, but Don was using that name prior to the recording. We didn't want it to be that. So it was, yeah, we'll get a band name. And I remember George and I left, and Don had to stay in Germany to mix and sing everything. And George, he was smarter. He goes, I know that guy's doing something. When we get back over there, it's going to be called Dokken. George Lynch. So one day we're back in Germany and drive to the city to a warehouse to go see our first record. It's at the printing plant. And we're sitting there in front of a pallet of records, and we open it up and we look at it, and there's a picture of Don on the cover, and it says Don Dokken. And there's no picture or mention of us on the record. And we're like, Don, what the fuck is this? And he goes, oh man, I don't know how this happened. Some heads are going to roll. I'm so pissed. I go, oh, I bet you are. Wild Mick Brown. So we got him to drop the Don. George Lynch. That's a compromise that he set up for himself to make it appear that he had compromised. Wild Mick Brown. That pissed George off completely, and I can see why. He was being lied to. And listen, to an artist, music is the most sacred thing. Sometimes it's the only thing you have in your life. And George, he never really let go of it. Remember that. Don Dokken. I figured, well, Van Halen, that's an unusual name. I'll call it Dokken, you know? Rhymes with rockin'. Okay, so at this point then, you almost have no choice but to feel like this is the source of all the shit between George and Don, right? I mean, how could it not be? So all these years later, when I was sitting here talking about Back for the Attack and their tour and the breakup of the band and all that stuff, and oh, why can't you guys just grow up and figure out how to get along? It turns out Don very well may have totally given George every reason to feel that way about him. Wouldn't all of us feel that way too if we were in those shoes? And it's not just what happened there, right? I mean, if you think about the long list of absolute shit George Lynch has gone through up to that point, it begins to paint a pretty clear picture of why he just always seemed so damn angry about everything back in the Dokken days. Geez, you're supposed to be getting handpicked by Kiss to go to record in New York City and open for them. I mean, they're literally standing in your dressing room before you play that night, telling you that's what might happen. Only they wind up liking the opening band better and taking them to record a demo instead. Oh, okay, but hey, that's cool. You're going to get to audition for Ozzy freaking Osbourne's band. Oh, but wait, Randy Rhoads gets that gig instead of you. Oh, well, but then fate steps in. Randy is killed in that plane crash in 1982, and Ozzy has to start auditioning guitar players again. Right around that time, a 19-year-old Warren DeMartini has been talked into moving to LA from San Diego by his friend Jakey Lee, who's just quit a band called Rat to join Rough Cut and thinks Warren is the perfect guy to take his place. Only Rat has gigs coming up that weekend they can't cancel, so Jake tells Warren, hey, you gotta come now. Warren heads up to LA, moves in with Jake and his girlfriend, and Jake already has the chords to Bark at the Moon, and Warren already has the chords to Round and Round, and they just sit around at night working on those great riffs. Okay, now, why am I talking about that? Just follow me here for a minute. Back to the book, chapter 16, Then I Got the Ozzy Gig. George Lynch. After Randy died, Ozzy had Brad Gillis from Nightrider playing guitar for him for a little bit. And I left Dokken for a minute and toured with Ozzy. I never played on stage during a live show, but I would go up and play at sound checks and at rehearsals. They were grooming me, basically. But then, Warren DeMartini. One day, Jake says to me, oh, you'll never believe this, but I got a call from Ozzy's manager and I'm going to try out. And what was weird was that not long before that, I was on the phone with George Lynch and he's like, yeah, man, I'm pretty sure I got the Ozzy gig. That was a strange thing because at that moment, I think I was probably the only person that knew what was going on, you know? Dana Strum. When I first found Randy for Ozzy, George Lynch was actually my second pick. And when Randy died in the plane crash in Florida, I was the person that held the auditions and brought Jake and George in. I was put in a bad position because I was told, Dana, we're going with this other guy. And I was like, but this guy has quit his job. He's got his bags here. And then Jake had the gig. Jakey Lee. George was there for my audition, and yeah, that sucked because I knew who he was. He was part of the scene, and after my audition, I'm packing up my gear and I'm by the exit door, and nobody has said anything to me. So I just figured I didn't get the gig. And that's when Sharon Osbourne walked up to me and said, we think you're the guy. And then Ozzy walked up next to her and he said, do you want the fucking gig? Yeah, I do. And at that moment, George came over and stood next to us. And he says, hey guys, what's up? And Ozzy turns to him and goes, you lost it. It's his now. And he walks away. Then it's just me and George standing there looking at each other. It was just a very awkward moment. George Lynch. I gotta say, it was pretty cold-hearted and really hit me hard, because I pretty much had nothing at the time. My wife and I had 2 little kids and we had an apartment. I was even working a side gig delivering liquor downtown in South Central. It was a dangerous job. And so when the Ozzy thing came along, we thought, this is it. This is really going to change our fortunes. Sharon Osbourne, manager Ozzy Osbourne and Lita Ford. Everybody took it for granted that George Lynch would get the gig, but Ozzy wasn't like, oh my God, I have to have this George Lynch. This is the guy for me. It wasn't a done deal. And then came Jakey, and everybody was like, yeah, this is the one. Jakey came in and was just, he was phenomenal. Ozzy Osbourne. George Lynch is an excellent guitar player, but Jake was a more tasty guitar player to me. Jakey Lee. If you ask George, he'll say I got the Ozzy gig because I had better hair. Sharon Osbourne. Of course he had better hair. He had better everything than George. Yeah, we've been through this before, but hang on, just trust me. George Lynch. I think their big thing with me was that I had cut my hair short. I didn't have that big rock look. But hey, I could have worn a wig. Ozzy was bald at the time. Warren DeMartini, that whole thing was a shocker because everyone that was hanging around in LA in that circle thought for sure that George was going to be the next guitar player in Ozzy. George Lynch. The Ozzy thing happened over the course of what was probably a couple of months. And when that ran its course and didn't work out for me, I thought, okay, well, so one night I went to see the Dokken guys at the Whiskey. They were there hanging out or something. And I go, are we putting this back together? And they were like, well, we don't know, George. I remember even Mick saying that to me. What? Really? I think they actually had Warren in the band for a second. They did. Wild Mick Brown. During that period when George was running around with Ozzy, we thought he was leaving. So we said, well, we've got to get somebody. And everybody was emulating George at the time. But then here comes Warren DeMartini. I don't think he ever did a gig with us, but we had claimed him as the guy. Don Dokken. George had quit the band. And in this interim, I was going to do one more showcase for Elektra and try to get them to keep us on the label. Juan Croucier was on bass, and I had met Warren DeMartini. He was kind of in Rat, but Rat hadn't really made it yet. George Lynch. Rat and Dokken rehearsed in the same facility, and I think Warren came in and was jamming with them for a while, so I went over and started jamming with Rat. Oh, God, to be a fly on those walls, right? Warren. I rehearsed with Dokken once, maybe twice. Don. In the middle of all this, Warren and Juan are playing with Rat at the same time. Everybody was kind of playing musical musicians, but Warren and Juan decided to go with Rat, and that was the end of it. George Lynch. At some point, Warren and I ran into each other in the hall, and I go, what are we doing? Why don't we just go back to our respective bands? So that's what we did. It was kind of funny. Wild Mick Brown. I remember looking at Warren one day and telling him, listen, dude, don't go with Rat. You'll never go anywhere with that band. They don't have any songs. When I hear myself say shit like that, Warren and I are still friends, and we laugh about it when we're drunk. Like, wow, how wrong can you be? Okay, so at this point, George is back in Dokken, and Dokken already has a record out in Germany and France. On a label called Carrere. And it's done sort of okay in Europe. According to Don, pretty well. But nothing really beyond any of that. Okay, so now one day, Alan Niven. So one day I roll into work and the receptionist at Green World asks if a friend of hers can come in and talk to me. He has a record that he wants me to listen to. And I said, sure. He comes into my office, puts his feet up on my desk, throws the European release of Breaking the Chains at me and says, I want you to do for me what you did for Motley Crue. And that was a guy called Don Dokken. Don Dokken. Alan knew somebody that worked at Elektra, and Breaking the Chains had come out on Carrere, and he says, you should take it to this guy I know, Tom Zutaut, and play it for him. Alan Niven. But Tom had just made a major decision by signing Motley Crue and was a bit reluctant to make another one. So for Dokken, I said, Tom, look, I know you've got a relationship with Cliff Bernstein and Peter Mensch at Q Prime Management. Do you mind if I send this record to them? And he connected me to Bernstein, who said, have Don call me. And of course, with Cliff and Peter on board, that enabled Tom to be more aggressive at Elektra, and that's how Don got on Elektra. Don Dokken. I get a phone call from a guy named Cliff Bernstein, and he says, I saw your record in an import store and I liked it. So he comes to LA and meets me. And you know how Cliff looks, right? Like a homeless person. He has that big, scruffy beard. I was expecting someone in a suit and tie. Cliff Bernstein. I felt that I was excited about Dokken and that I could do something with them. So Tom Zutaut said, great, let me sign them over here to Elektra. And Joe Smith was the head of Elektra at the time, as I recall. So Tom goes in there and, quote, gets them signed. And we make some kind of deal. It's not an expensive deal, it's a cheap deal. The record is already made. Then Joe Smith leaves the company and Bob Krasnow takes over. And Tom Zutaut calls me and says, Cliff, I have some bad news. Krasnow is not interested in this, so we're backing out of the deal. And I said, oh, this is terrible. Because really remember, obviously we had Def Leppard as management clients then, but they weren't Def Leppard with a capital D and a capital L. We didn't know if we had a future with Def Leppard. I would know it in a few months, but I didn't know it then. So this was really kind of a big blow. Don Dokken. It became like a joke. So, Don, do you have a record deal or do you not have a record deal? I'd say, I don't know. Depends on what day it is. Ask me tomorrow. Alan Niven. Don and I formed a friendship. We lived together. He was the guy who introduced me to Dante Fox, who became Great White. So Dokken winds up getting signed by Elektra, partially because Elektra was looking at these guys and thinking, well, I mean, there's already a record done, and we can just clean it up a little bit and put it out and see what happens, which gives us the definitely remixed and also partially re-recorded 1983 US version of Breakin' the Chains. Not at all unlike Motley Crue's Too Fast for Love album, when you think about it, which was also remixed, partially re-recorded, and then re-released on Elektra a year earlier. Okay, so now we move on to chapter 26 in the good book here, entitled George and Don Hated Each Other. Really hated each other. Even band manager Cliff Bernstein apparently has almost no idea just how toxic two of the personalities in the band Dokken are to each other. Cliff Bernstein. Today, if I knew how bad the situation was between two band members like it was with Don and George, I would probably have had the conversation up front and say, unless we can solve this to my satisfaction right now, I'm not interested. Back then, much younger and with lots less experience, I might have thought, I'll figure out a way of dealing with it. But now I know that there are some things that are so deep-seated that even if you're an expert in human psychology or behavior, there's not much you can do about it. And that brings me to a point where I have to say a few things about that psychology. First, I don't blame any one person for any of this bullshit that was constantly fueling the feuding between Don and George. It seems to me that they're both at fault here, completely. When you read through all this stuff and you sit through all these interviews, it all just seems so simple looking back. Hey, Don, don't do this, okay? Don't try to take the song Paris with you to Germany. Don't ask Mick to come be in the band. Don't say, okay, George can come too. Don't try to call it Don Dokken if you really knew that was what was going to be on the record. If you do this way, those guys are never, ever going to be able to trust you fully. And you won't be able to blame them for feeling that way either. And either way, That's just no place to begin a professional relationship from, let alone a friendship. And like Bernstein said, sometimes I just feel like somebody should have stopped this version of Dokken from ever forming in the first place. And that's a big conundrum for me, honestly, because what this band gave us for this short period of time is still so good and I think so valuable. But it was a double-edged sword at every single step of the journey with these guys. I mean, it seems like it would have been so much easier to step in and say, "What are you thinking? You don't want to be in a band with this guy," meaning George or Don, I think. "Why would you ever agree to be in a band with someone you feel this way about?" I mean, George doesn't trust Don. He's just been completely fucked over by Ozzy. Don doesn't want George, he just wants Mick, but Mick tells him it's a package deal. Don could just find another drummer and avoid a decade or more of tension and arguments and basically torture at the hands of a guy he can't get away from for months at a time. And it all could have been so much easier. Don had to know a gazillion other drummers in LA. Just pick one. And then Mick and George can go ahead and keep trying to get signed with someone else singing, doing the heavier kind of material they apparently wanted to do all along anyway, instead of constantly fighting against Don's desire to sing ballads. Plus, Don wants to play guitar. And if you've seen any of that early live footage from 81 or 82, you know that Don's a pretty damn good guitarist. Not only that, but I don't necessarily know that Don's as great as just a frontman with a microphone in his hand. I think he's much stronger with a guitar in his hands while he's singing. But at some point, I'm not sure exactly when, but definitely before Tooth and Nail, George apparently insists that Don is done playing guitar in Dokken, which Don agrees to for some reason I still haven't figured out. Now, I'm not saying I don't want George to be the only guitarist in whatever band he hits the big time in. I'm just saying, again, maybe that band being Dokken isn't necessarily the only option. And maybe it's not the best option. And I'm saying, Don, don't agree to stop playing guitar on stage and on the records. I mean, we had bands like Maiden and Priest and Rat, yes, but I could have really enjoyed another two-guitar band in the mid-'80s. We eventually also got Wasp, and of course we already had Kiss and a few others. But we also had a lot of one-guitar bands already, and if Dokken has a two-guitar lineup, then that just makes it a lot easier for Jeff and Mick to also take a few lead vocals from time to time and let Don just play guitar on certain songs if he wants to. I think that would have been really cool. I find it endlessly fascinating also that no less than 3 of the guys from Rat, everybody but Stephen Pearcy and Robin Crosby, were playing with Don Dokken at some point in the late 70s or early 80s. Bobby Blotzer was the drummer for a time in Airborne, of course, and then Warren and Juan were actually in Dokken together for a very short time after the very first version of Breaking the Chains, with just Don on the cover, was released. I'm also always interested in just how Jeff Pilson finally wound up in the band. And I say that mainly because if it were me, I probably would have taken one look at Don and George giving each other dirty looks and told them I'd rather have a tooth pulled than spend any amount of time around them together. But yeah, I'm still glad this is the version of Dokken we wound up with because I think it's the best version we were probably ever going to get. Go figure. Like I said, a bit of a conundrum for me. I want both things at the same time. I want them to have peace. I want this to not be the topic of conversation in every goddamn interview I ever read in a magazine in the 1980s. But I also want them to realize that this is the best version of the band and the one that we and they deserve. Okay, now the three different versions of the album. The 1981 German Don Dokken pressing called Breakin' the Chains instead of Breaking. This is the original mix of the album. It basically sounds like a demo of the 1983 version, slightly more raw, some people say a little heavier sounding, a little more in your face in the mix. According to George Lynch, who wasn't happy about it, of course, there were 500 copies of this version of the album printed up in Germany with Don on the cover, wrapped in chains under the moniker of Don Dokken instead of Dokken. Also in 1981, there's a French pressing, slightly more finished sounding, to me at least, a lot more similar to the mix of the 83 version. But both of these versions, the German and the French, have the same track listing, a different track listing than the 83 Elektra one that most of us probably own. For instance, instead of Live to Rock, Rock to Live, we get basically the same music with completely different lyrics and the title We're Illegal. For my money, this original version is absolutely terrible. I literally almost cannot stand to listen to it these days. It's nice once or twice to satisfy your curiosity, sure, but I definitely prefer the rewrite. Another example is the earlier version of Paris is Burning, which is simply called Paris on both of these earlier versions of the album, where it's a studio track rather than the live version we got in the 83 release. The Paris version is apparently Don Dokken playing all the guitars in the studio, yes, even the solo, with Peter Baltes of Accept on bass guitar and Bobby Blotzer on drums. And as several people have noted previously in the comments on one of the videos of that song on YouTube, the drum intro Blotzer plays on this studio version is exactly the same drum intro he uses a year later for Rat's Sweet Cheater on their 1983 released EP. I like this studio version pretty well, actually, but nothing can compare to that live one we got in 83 to me. Nothing. As for the other tracks, they all sound at least slightly different than the 83 versions. Some of that is the remixing. Some of it is different parts being added or taken away on the guitars, a different mixture of background vocal harmonies in certain places, things like that. Stick to Your Guns gets totally re-recorded for the Elektra version, apparently. Now, one of the big sort of recent discoveries I was slightly surprised by with regard to this album is the fact that, according to Don Dokken at least, Juan Croucier, who is pictured on the album jacket and named as the bassist on the album, either barely plays on the album or didn't at all. As for which is actually the case, I'll let you listen to the Full and Bloom conversations with Don and decide for yourself, just like I had to. I'll put links to those in the description below this video. Wikipedia will tell you that Juan played and sang at least background vocals on We're Illegal, which Juan also helped write, and on Felony, while except Peter Baltes is listed as having played on the rest of the tracks. Juan also at least helped to write I Can't See You, but that's apparently the most he can be given credit for, Again, according to Don in one of his Full in Bloom interviews. But I'm pretty sure I've heard Juan say the same thing himself. I just can't remember where that was. There was apparently some issue with Juan being able or willing to fly to Germany to record on the album, though Don says he did join the band later on for a European tour. Juan is definitely playing with Don, George, and Mick in video clips from a European TV show they did called Beat Club back in those days. Now, Wikipedia also lists Don Dokken as the lead guitarist on Stick to Your Guns and Young Girls. And that's something I've always wondered about. Who was really soloing on some of these tracks? More than just those two, actually, as some of them just haven't ever sounded like George to me. But the band must have agreed really early on to never talk about any of that in magazines or whatever, because I've never heard them do so. Anyway, I'm pretty sure I've rambled enough for this video already. Let's get into the 1983 Breaking the Chains tracks. I love this track. I love this version of it. It's a well-written tune, well-constructed, and I seriously don't know that I've ever met anyone who's heard the song and didn't at least like it quite a bit. Definitely 5 stars for me, though definitely not quite my favorite song on the album, but we'll get to that. Really fun music video to watch these days, just like it was back in the mid-80s when you were seeing it for the first time, if you're like me, after you'd already been introduced to Dokken with the Tooth and Nail album and videos. Favorite thing from the video? Definitely George's chain guitar strings, the super dramatic way Don sings the whole thing, the part where the guys are all chained up in that dungeon until George somehow breaks his chains just in time to only miss the first note or two of the guitar solo. And then as he breaks the other guys out, naturally, the first thing they think to do now that they've been liberated is just to stand there and air drum and stuff. I mean, right? How could you possibly think to do anything else at a time like that? Oh, and my friends and I making fun of Don every time we watched this video, being chained to that bed with his super smooth mannequin-looking hairless legs showing. God, just nothing better than the 80s, is there? This was the only single Elektra released from the album in the States when they re-released the album. I'm not sure why exactly, but it does seem to suggest that they didn't have a really big sense of faith in the album. Now, one of the things I want to say right up front is that I am fully in favor of the resequencing that was done for this version of the album, meaning that I think this running order is definitely better than the Carrere releases. On those 2 releases, the sequence we get is Breaking the Chains, Seven Thunders, I Can't See You in the middle, and We're Illegal for side 1. And then Paris, Stick to Your Guns, Young Girls, Felony, and finally Nightrider for side 2. I really like this song most of the time. I like the guitars. I like Don's vocal. Yet for some reason, I only give it 3 stars. It's probably just one of those, I'm not sure this is what I want from this band things, I suppose. But I do think it's a good tune. I can also still remember that my cousin Billy was visiting one summer. That's the same cousin who introduced me to Kiss with the Rock and Roll Over album when I was 6. And I introduced him to this cassette somehow. I don't recall exactly how that went down now, but anyway, he just immediately took to the entire album and wouldn't stop listening to it until he went back home nearly a week later. I mean, he introduced me to stuff like Rock and Roll Over and Blizzard of Oz. And then I must have just been playing this by happenstance one day, and he nearly lost his mind over how great he thought the whole album was. Good times. Good tune. Our official introduction to pervy Don lyrics. Oh boy. Well, I hope you like them because you definitely haven't heard the last of those. 3 stars. My biggest memory of this song is that at one point a boombox tried to eat my cassette for some reason, and I was able to save it with a little bit of Scotch tape. But then there was this garbled section in one of the choruses here that I had to live with until they invented and I purchased the CD, which was many years later. So now, even though I haven't heard that mangled cassette in like 3 decades, and now I listen to this album only on other formats, I still always hear that crappy section in the back of my mind. Brains are weird, right? I never loved this song, honestly. It's fine, just fine. I did give it 3 stars, which is what fine means. Just sort of a whatever song. Okay, really cool intro guitar lick. Really cool music throughout the song. Thank goodness the lyrics and title got changed. As I said before, I can barely stand this as We're Illegal. Meanwhile, I like this version well enough to give it 4 stars. And now we move to side 2 of the album. Another thank goodness for me is the fact that they moved this track to the side 2 opening slot instead of being the album closer. I don't like it in that closing slot nearly as much. Now, that said, this is absolutely one of my favorite tracks on the album. I just love how moody it is. I love the lyric. I love the vocal. I love the guitars and that nice steady rhythm section that just keeps going under the whole thing. I don't think I felt this way back when I first got the cassette, but this is definitely 5 stars for me. And I would call this a nearly perfect track. My friends and I always sort of assumed this title was probably inspired by the guy, Nightrider guy in the movie Mad Max. No idea if that's actually true, but we always enjoyed thinking it. Nice riff in the intro. Sounds a bit like something from the first couple of Armored Saint albums. I'm not sure exactly how to explain it, but I'm giving this song 4 stars. Other than that riff, I don't know that I love any single part of the song, but I do seem to really appreciate those parts when they're put together as a whole for some reason. I listen to it even now and I think, that's not a great song, but I just didn't feel right going with 3 stars for some reason, so I didn't. Really nice scream from Dawn in this song. Okay, here's another lyric and title my friends and I used to have a good laugh at. If I could be friends with Ricky Gervais, I'm pretty confident we might sit around all day just laughing and asking each other, is Don a pedo? Yeah, I gave it 3 stars, but if I get a call from Child Services, I will definitely deny that and say I just read it wrong on accident while I was filming this. I'm not the kind of person who quits, even when the chips are down. You gotta fight for what you want. Don't give up, stick to your guns. You gotta fight for what you want. Gotta believe in what you do. Okay, and another discussion my friends and I used to have a lot was, has anyone ever written a song called Stick to Your Guns that doesn't suck? 2 stars. Now, don't get all pissy if you feel like it's Dokken's Bohemian Rhapsody or something. We all have to live our own lives. I get it. And now we get to the last track on the album. And I'm not going to beat around the bush here, peeps. I'm pretty sure I've said it somewhere in one of my other videos on this channel before. I'm going to say it again. This track, this live version, Paris is Burning, is my favorite Dokken song of all time. It has been for a really long time, probably since not long after the first time I heard it, which is pretty amazingly ironic if you think about it, considering it's probably the track that actually started all the problems between these guys in the very beginning of the band. But I just can't fault the track in any way. It's totally a 5-star song for me. And in fact, I have to say that it's one of my favorite recordings ever by anyone. The lyrics Don came up with to replace whatever the original lyrics might have been are just fabulous, in my opinion. I absolutely love them. And that chord progression, that rhythm section, that vocal, just awesome. But then you add that Lynch guitar solo that introduces the song, and I just, wow. And I can still remember watching my guitar teacher play that intro solo right there in front of me and sound just like George, and me just losing my mind. Okay, so that's 37 stars divided by 10 tracks, which equals a 3.7 star rating out of 5 for the album. And honestly, I think that seems just about right, given how these albums would progress over the next half decade or so. But what I'd really like is to know from you guys and gals in the comments here, what are your thoughts on Breaking the Chains? Favorite tracks? Least favorites? On another topic, what do you think of Lynch's solo at the beginning of Paris is Burning? How would you compare it to Eruption or maybe Randy Rhoads' guitar solo on the Ozzy tribute album? All right, folks. I'm not sure exactly where we're going next, but I'll see you next time right here on Hard Rock Reverie. Take care, everyone.